So welcome everyone to the Student Equity Network, which is part of the STARS conference in 2021. This is our 5th iteration of the network, and it's great to see a few regulars as well as a few new people join us. Before I go much further and introduce my co-hosts and co-conveners, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I know that you are, right across the Australian continent, and we have colleagues joining from New Zealand. So wherever you are, my thanks to traditional elders, past, present, and emerging, for their care of the land. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I thank them for their care of the land wherever you are. I would like to introduce my co-hosts. So I introduce myself and then my co-host. My name is Nadine Zacharias. I'm the Director Student Engagement at Swinburne in Melbourne, and I'm an Associate Professor of Higher Education. My co-hosts this year are Professor Sally Kift, and I'm particularly pleased that Sally has joined again to share her wisdom and deep expertise and insight in this space as part of the presentation, as well as one of the hosts of a breakout room. Sally is a visiting fellow at the National Centre for Student Equity and Higher Education, the NESHE, a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and has a range of other affiliations and achievements, as you well know. Also, particular welcome to Kylie Austin, who's the Associate Director, Student Academic Success and Partnership at the University of Wollongong, and the President of IFIA, and super committed because Kylie has a very little person at home who might come to join us during the session. So we'll watch out for her. And thank you so much, Kylie, for your commitment and passion for this space, and for contributing to the session today. That is super. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to break this session into 3 roughly equal parts. We are going to provide a bit, or I am going to provide a bit of a policy update. This network tends to combine people who are in the equity policy space quite deeply, and others who haven't had a lot of exposure to it. So I think to get everybody on a level playing field, I just do a really quick run through the equity policy framework that we have in Australia. I'm always a bit conscious, that we're not explicitly covering the New Zealand context in this particular network group, but our friends from across the ditch have been very accommodating, and have shared and introduced their perspectives into the Australian-centric conversation. So it's been quite a fruitful exchange, and I hope that will happen today as well. Sally is then going to introduce the topic of products and pathways in the lifelong learning ecosystem, because there has been so much change, and it will give her an opportunity to talk about her pet project, which is the AQF. I just had to throw that in. And then Kylie is going to share with us work that she and her colleagues have done for IFIA, really on the state of higher education, of student equity in higher education during a period of great change. So in, still the midst of a global pandemic, as well as major funding and policy reform for higher education, and how this is playing out on the ground. And we're interested to hear more about this in the breakouts as well. So this is the first half hour, and we'll have a quick round of questions and comments after the presentations. Then we're going to break into 3 groups. It's not a very democratic process. Kylie is the holder of the breakout groups, so you will be assigned to one of the breakout rooms, because the logistics would have been too complicated otherwise. So I hope that is okay with everyone. And then we'll come back for the final half an hour to share the conversations from each of the 3 breakout rooms, and to talk a little bit about what is next. We have picked 3 questions that are a bit curly and a bit contested, because we feel that equity practitioners need to have a position, and IFIA is in a position to put a position to the department So we thought we'd use this opportunity to really get a finger on the pulse and check in with you as a group of colleagues and fellow practitioners as to your views on these 3 challenges. I hope that is okay. If anybody has any immediate concerns or questions before we launch, please raise your hand or please put something in the chat. Otherwise, I shall launch into it. Okay. So the Australian Student Equity Policy Framework, Australia is one of the few countries who has been in this space for 25 plus years. Ever since the launch of A Fair Chance for All in 1990, which became the policy white paper that really kicked off a conversation about student equity work in Australia. That got a major boost through the introduction of the Higher Education Participation in Partnerships Program, the HEP, in 2010, alongside the uncapping of higher education places through the demand-driven funding system. And what we have seen, and the wonderful work that our colleagues at the NESHI have done with their equity data tables and program, is we have really shifted the dial in terms of participation and growth of equity group cohorts in the sector, and particularly for students from low SES backgrounds, students with disability and Indigenous students. If you haven't been there yet and have played with the tables, I really commend that you do it because it paints a really, really compelling picture. The program, the HEP program as it existed from 2010 to 2020 is set out on this slide. So we had the core objective was for universities to undertake activities and implement strategies that improve access to undergraduate courses for people from low SES backgrounds, and then improve their retention and completion rates, which increasingly became the focus. So the focus was on one particular equity group, and that was students from low SES communities. There have always been a number of exclusions for what couldn't be funded with HEP, including infrastructure, transport vehicles, general facilities and services. The structure was, and that was captured in the Equity Initiatives Framework that our colleagues at CIHI in particular worked on under the leadership of Anna Bennett. So we produced this life cycle approach of pre-access, access, participation and transition out, and the HEP can fund initiatives across each of these life cycle stages. It's governed by the other grants guidelines, which is pursuant to the HISA, which is our core act of Parliament, and it was a massive injection of funds. So when the HEP came in, it represented 12 times the amount of funding annually than its predecessor. So it was a massive, massive injection in funding. That was the state of affairs pre the reforms. I share with you a bit of policy work that we did in the intervening time, and then I tell you what happened instead. So in 2018, my colleague Brett and Sally was majorly involved in this effort as well. We conducted under the auspice of the NESHI a national consultation process to talk to our colleagues about where we want to take this piece of policy, this area of policy over the medium term. And so our time frame was out to 2030. And many of you have seen this before, but I wanted to remind you of that proposed policy statement that we put to the department and the wider sector at the time, which really focused on universal participation. So the vision as we articulated it in the Best Chance for All was that Australia's future depends on all its people, whoever and wherever they are, being enabled to successfully engage in beneficial lifelong learning. So we felt it was useful to move away from a focus on particular groups and instead, look at it through the lens of universal participation, of everybody can participate, and introduce a concept of lifelong participation. So this is not something that we do as particularly young people. We will engage with the tertiary education system across the life course because we have to. It's a necessity, and there was a perception that this is not particularly straightforward right now, and those of you who work with mature age students are acutely aware of that. So that was the possibility that we put to the department. What they did instead was the Job Ready Graduates package, which has, as you're probably well aware, introduced quite a bit of pain across the sector. What I'm focusing on here is the introduction of the ELSEF. So while the HEP continues as a program, it has been absorbed in the broader Indigenous, Regional and Low SES Attainment Fund, which is a combination of the HEP, regional loading and enabling loading. And the idea is that that policy arrangement provides more flexibility to university of how to use their funding. It has been, so we talked a bit about this in preparing this session. Flexibility has always been a hallmark of HEP, and it has been an advantage of HEP. But what we are seeing now with, the focus, the laser-like focus on students from low SES backgrounds being loosened and expanded to Indigenous students and students from regional backgrounds, there is serious concern that the flexibility might, now be exploited for less productive activity. So we have both flexibility and 3 groups now. And so collectively, we think we need to come to terms with what that means for how funding gets allocated and how students benefit in that particular setup, policy setup. There was also additional partnerships funding, which was quite small, so $7 million over 4 years, not a lot of money, to increase aspiration of school students in regional Australia. So the focus has shifted to particularly regional participation, and I'll show you this next slide with the formula. I don't want to, I'll stay with this. So what is happening is the funding formula is changing. So previously 100% of the funding got allocated on the basis of participation by low SES students. This is shifting now, 45% students from low SES, 45% students from regional remote backgrounds, and 10% Indigenous students. You all know that there's much overlap and crossover between those 3 groups, but students get counted every time. So if you have a student who is an Indigenous student from a regional area in a low SES postcode, they get counted 3 times. What this does is, and that came up in a recent session that Sally chaired a few weeks ago, is that funding gets majorly shifted out of urban universities that have particularly supported low SES cohorts towards regional institutions because of that change of funding. We are feeling this acutely at Swinburne because we are in a similar boat. We had fairly good representation of students from low SES backgrounds, much less so for students from regional and remote backgrounds because we are an urban institution. So they are the ones that get particularly hit by this change of funding, and we are not quite sure yet how this will play out. This is the formula. I'll spare you this. So the last thing I want to say on policy is, at the same time as the policy settings are changing, the department has also for the first time wrapped universities over the knuckles, so to say, in providing a bit of feedback and commentary on the way that we have spent HEP funds. So they've pointed out that other student cohorts get included in HEP programs, including international and postgraduate students, which are not allowed. The focus is to be on current prospective domestic undergrad students from low SES backgrounds, which now also include Indigenous and regional remote students. They have criticised the expenditure on general student wellbeing and academic services and programs. And again, and we'll explore in my breakout group, this is common practice to cross-subsidise. And then there is evidence, the evidence of participation is often limited and in some instances not reported at all. So they are sort of three criticisms that they have pulled out and shared with the sector broadly. So no institution has been called out at this stage, but I guess it is saying to the sector, you know, we are taking note potentially for the first time of how you are actually expending these funds. The last slide that I want to share with you is you know, picks up on that theme of evaluation. So the Commonwealth has commissioned the development of a student equity in higher education evaluation framework, or the CHEF, that has gone to our colleagues at the ISSR, Wojtek Tomaszewski and his group, who have done quite a few projects now for the department. They looked at the equity groups review. They did the study on cumulative disadvantage and have produced, you know, some really groundbreaking work. So no surprises that this has gone to them. And this is in development. The timeline is October. Some of you might have already been engaged in their consultation processes. And yeah, we'll wait with interest where this is going to land. Okay, so this was the policy overview. That was a real quick run through what was and what is, and I'll hand over now to Sally to talk about products and pathways in the lifelong learning ecosystem. Sally, over to you.
So thanks very much, Nadine. And there's been some comments in the chat about whether we might be able to make these slides available. We might prevail upon our friends at Neshi in that regard. So I'm going to introduce some fairly random thoughts, but really off the back of the Best Chance for All's focus on the lifelong learning criticality now that faces all learners and workers. I suppose Industry 4.0 brought that very much to the forefront. COVID has exacerbated it. Next, please, Nadine. So I just thought I would start here with the 2019 background paper from the Shergold review, quoting colleagues Shipley and Stubbe in 2018. And you can see that we've done fairly well in terms of familiarising school leaders around the pathways to university. The light blue and the blue are all strong understanding, good understanding, and then it goes pink, dark pink and orange, which is a nice colour arrangement. But you see against the various other possible pathways, vocational education, training, apprenticeships, traineeships, prior education providers, there's very little understanding. And so there's a problem for us right from the get-go. The Commonwealth data, the Commonwealth Department says that 90% of employment growth over the next 5 years to 2024 will require a post-secondary qualification. Certainly the majority of that would seem to be located in the bachelor area, but still a fair percentage of it is in certificate 2 or 3. So what do we do as equity practitioners thinking about the lifelong learning ecosystem and trying to familiarise students with this understanding about their pathways, particularly now with all this confusion about micro-credentials that I'll come to in a moment, and there is so much online and free other shorter form credentials available to increase learning apparently. Next please, Nadine. So this gets me to the AQF, which is one of my favourite subjects. I do realise I need to get out much, much more. But I did want to point out that the AQF Australian Qualifications Framework Review, which I'll put a link to in the chat when I finish my few slides, did have very strong equity underpinnings and talked about the need to widen participation and make lifelong learning a practical reality for all, particularly to improve the educational attainment levels of those with low levels of participation and attainment. So that's really where we started. Next, Nadine. We had a few things to say about that, and this is probably not where you would expect me to go, but credit pathways and recognition are absolutely critical to this. And we had some work done for the AQF review, which showed us that, unsurprisingly, the pathways are not clear and credit recognition is not easy for students. They don't really have a portable currency around that. So we made 3 or 4 and many other very good recommendations, but particularly around enhancing the pathways policy to enable broader credit recognition. We suggested gently a prototype for AQF a prototype for an AQF credential point system to enable that nationally consistent currency that students could take from one institution to another. And we also suggested that there needed to be much more detailed guidance on recognition of prior learning in the pathways policy, including for shorter form credentials, if they come to be, as they seem to be, very big players. Thank you, Nadine. And I did a particular mention of enabling. So we did make a recommendation around enabling, which currently sits outside the Australian Qualifications Framework, which I think is a big risk for these programs, because what you can't see and you really can't count can very easily be done away with. And I think we get a bit of a sense of that enabling's been under threat and pressure for quite some time. We did suggest and recommend in the AQF view that a AQF qualification type be developed once common learning outcomes for enabling programs have been developed, and the National Association of Enabling Educators in Australia, and I'll put the link in the chat when I'm finished, have prepared those, have developed those common learning outcomes for enabling programs. Thanks, Nadine. So this gets me to a very attractive diagram around this lifelong learning ecosystem, because I think it's incumbent on us as equity practitioners. It would be nice if the higher education sector more broadly could articulate this plainly and clearly in the interests of not self-interest, but we need to understand it and we need to be able to articulate it. So as I said, 90% of jobs will require in the next 5 years of a post-secondary qualification. So that almost makes tertiary access foundational. I've carefully put vocational education and higher education on the same level there. It might look like vocational education actually wins, but anyway, it's not a competition. Even better if we can blend vocational education and higher education, next Nadine. But then once they've acquired this foundational post-secondary qualification, then we need to explain to everyone what the lifelong learning up and reskilling ecosystem looks like. And that can be done in very many and varied ways. And this is where the shorter form credentials come into being. But there's also so much free do-it-yourself upskilling. There's experience, and Deakin in particular is very good at credentialing, on-the-job training and prior recognition of learning and experience. Nadine, that's another build there, and experience from learning integrated work. And as we know, this is so much dependent on access to good career advising. It would be nice if we had an accumulating document and lifelong learning record and enabling that better credit recognition. So my last slide, Nadine, is around just to give you some arguments, because I think after the Campus Morning Mail series, Verity Firth wrote and said, well, I've got to have this chat at the big table at my institution about micro-credentials. It would be useful to have some arguments around, well, positive arguments, of course, but insight into what the issues are. So all I've tried to do here is collect together some issues around micro-credentials, because the unquestioning embrace of them is going to be very difficult for us unless we have this lifelong learning narrative. And you'll see some of the issues. The first dot point there, Chakran and Kylie, is a UNESCO piece, making the obvious point that stacking to form a macro credential might not be conceptually sound and might not be recognisable. It might not lead to a coherent qualification. Michael Healy from USQ says they're not tickets to employment in their own right. Are they going to meet particular learners' goals? Will learners miscalculate what their needs are? Will learners be able to express their value to employers? Buchanan, an Australian piece at Al done for UNESCO, talks about the fragmentation of education. Moody and Wellahan talk about micro-credentials being the most recent attempt to match education work by changing education and leaving work again unchanged. And I think there's a big piece there. And I know that Trina Desandore is in the room with us, and they've said you can't assure with David Bowd said you can't assure macro-credential learning in terms of assessment. Repackaging existing units into micro-credentials must be regarded with suspicion. Thanks for that, Trina and Dave. And I'm done. I think I'm handing now over to the wonderful Kylie. Oh, and the next slide is just the references with the links there. And as I said, I think we might prevail upon Neshi to put these slides up for us. So Kylie, welcome. And I hope your little one is adorable, of course.
Yeah, thank you. She's out on the back on the trampoline at the moment, so it's nice and quiet here. So I'll smash through it while it's nice and quiet inside the house. Thank you, Nadine and Sally, for inviting EFIA to join this discussion. And it's so wonderful to see so many familiar colleagues and EFIA members joining the session today. I want to talk about a couple of elements in terms of what EFIA is doing, and also some broader things that are happening by the federal government's Department of Education, Schools and Employment that we're hoping to inform and contribute to as a result of this session. So just to kind of get us started, obviously the government at the end of last year formed the Equity in Higher Education panel. And the role of that panel is to develop an equity roadmap towards 2024. So we're very well aware that, you know, come 2024, that the equity policy space is potentially going to look quite a bit different for us as practitioners compared to what we're operating in with at the moment. And there has been a number of appointments made to the Equity Higher Education panel, including a range of Vice Chancellors, key staff, including our colleagues at the National Centre who are joining us today, and representative from the departments as well as those individuals listed here, that are helping to inform that strategic body of work. And so the advisory body really is taking the lead in terms of providing advice and recommendations to the department, and developing a 5-year strategy in terms of what does equity policy look like in higher education. So whether that's aspiration activities, improved access to higher ed, participation, retention, success and completion. And so this panel for us is really the panel that we're talking to as practitioners in terms of how do we influence what this future policy looks like, given the range of experiences that all of us have had in this room. How can we inform this panel to, you know, from the coalface and have a really strong influence in terms of what policy looks like longer term. So when EFIA is talking to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, they are referring to this panel as having a really strong influence in terms of what the equity policy looks like from 2024 onwards. Nadine, I'll just get you to change slides for me. So as part of this work, what EFIA has done to date has really tried to look at, you know, what does the state of equity look like at the moment in the current policy environment, and how have institutions responded to that? And certainly the era that we're living in terms of equity policy at the moment, and this is reflective in a recent survey that EFIA undertook, is that the equity policy is very quite descriptive in the sense that it allows a lot of institutional decision making in terms of how they're going to apply the equity policy to the needs of their context and their institution. And so when we have, obviously COVID-19 was a very big catalyst for institutions to change and shift practice. And as the president of EFIA and my colleagues on the executive, we're hearing a lot of anecdotal feedback from across the sector as to what was happening within our institutions. And so what EFIA decided to do was to do a formal survey across all institutions, and the survey is still running and we're still collecting some further data at the moment. So this, what we're presenting here, is really an interim insight into what is happening. But we are seeing institutions making decisions about equity policy that is that can be both positive and negative to how the equity policy is being implemented at an institutional level. Some of the trends that we're seeing across Australian higher education institutions has been that there has been an overall reduction in a dedicated and visible student equity team. What we're seeing is that a number of equity teams are being subsumed into other units. So widening participation teams are being coupled with recruitment teams, or current facing equity initiatives are being bundled into broader student support. So the visibility of student equity within institutions is decreasing in the last 18 months. We're also seeing a substantial loss of student equity focused staff. And when we heard from colleagues across the sector, they were referencing major institutional restructures. And despite many institutions maintaining their level of equity funding this year, some institutions have reported a loss of over 50% of their equity-focused staff in their institutions. Equity continues to feature in all of the strategic planning documents of the universities that were surveyed. However, practitioners largely felt that, you know, it was a bit of a nod in the strategic plan, but it wasn't being spoken to on the ground, and that the policy wasn't being enacted as there were higher priorities in this kind of COVID environment in shifting practice. And the majority of universities identified that there was an absence of an equity champion for equity within their institution. So I remember 15 years ago when I started in the equity space, a lot of institutions had, you know, a deputy vice chancellor of equity and diversity. And there's probably only 2 institutions who participated in this survey who had that very visible champion dedicated at the moment. So one of the other, we've started to see, you know, that equity policy change start to shift in 2020-21, and that is, as Nadine spoke about earlier, the introduction of the ILSAF. And universities have responded in a variety of ways. And so many universities have broadened the representation on their internal HEP governance committees to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff. Some institutions are being more proactive in their knowledge sharing and coordination across various university units that have responsibility for Indigenous, low SES and regional student success. We have seen an expansion of some schools' outreach and widening participation activities into regional, rural and remote communities, but we also received some feedback as well that given the reduction in equity staffing in some of these spaces, that a lot of the widening participation activities were being contracted as well. There was an increased financial commitment to scholarships that included accommodation for regional students and increased funding allocated to regional Indigenous cohorts. So a lot of these shifts that were happening within institutions were in response to the changing government policy with the expansion of the equity groups from low SES being the primary targeted equity cohort to including low SES, regional, rural and remote students and students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. Okay. We started to canvass some of the equity practitioners as well in terms of the development of future equity policy. And so a lot of the feedback that we're receiving from EFIA was that there's greater clarity needed on the intersection of diverse student equity funding sources. So we've, in addition to the now ILSAF or HEP, we've also got the Disability Support Fund and the Indigenous Student Success Program that are all happening concurrently. The other element was also around ensuring safeguards to continue the separation between outreach and widening participation and student recruitment initiatives. And so some of the language in the new ILSAF policy is around increasing access, and that access component is certainly much stronger where we have been really focused on aspiration in policy documents in the past as well. And that currently at the moment, we've got Australian higher education institutions, as we all would very much be familiar with at the moment, operating in constrained financial environments. And so most universities are also reporting a decrease in staffing for their general student support services. So for example, like a generalist student support role or disability services. And so they're flagging that this is going to impact equity students disproportionately you know, during this period as well, as often that they're the groups that access, you know, the general student support services as well. So basically, you know, today EFIA has, we've kind of dipped our toe in the pond in a little bit in some ways in canvassing equity practitioners across the sector in terms of what's happening in higher education institutions to help us inform the development of future equity policy. This kind of workshop today is another piece in that larger jigsaw puzzle of how can we, you know, put together a submission to the Equity Higher Education panel to help inform what does that roadmap and what does that future equity policy look like from 2024 and beyond. And so really today is about, you know, what are the non-negotiables that we want as Australian higher education practitioners to ensure that what institutions are doing with the equity policy and the equity funding is happening within our institutions. So what do we want to be seeing happening at a policy level to ensure our institutions are being kept accountable effectively as well. So that's what we're hoping to kind of get out of today. So what we're going to do is put all of you into randomly into these 3 groups, and Nadine, Sally and I have come up with 3 different contentious, I think you described it, Nadine, topic areas for us all to discuss. And what we're going to be doing with today is breaking it into smaller groups of about 15 people, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and Nadine, Sally and I will introduce these topics in a bit more detail once we get into those rooms. We're going to have about 20 minutes to have a bit of a discussion around what our position is on each of these topics, and we're going to allocate a scribe and a note taker for each of these sessions, and that person is then going to come back and present to the group, and we'll have some opportunities for the broader group to provide input into the topic as well. And so this will start to inform a submission, I guess, to the Department of Education and the Higher Education panel. So is there anything else, Nadine and Sally, that you want to add, or we're just going to go for it?
I think we go for it and jump straight in, and we can sort of potentially do some urgent questions or comments at the start of each session, but then focus on the breakout topic.
Great. Okay, I'll hit the go button, and my group, if you guys just want to start introducing yourselves, I'll just make sure everyone's in a group and then I'll jump in.
Okay, super. Thank you. Okay. Do we have everybody back? I can't see. Look, I am clearly not the Zoom person. We're a Teams institution, so here we are. I'm always sort of a bit on thin ice with the Zoom friends. We have Tracy. We have Sally. We have Kylie. Yes, here we are. Okay, super. Look, if your conversation was anything like mine, we're in for a bit of a treat, and we really got somewhere on general services, but we'll start off with Sally's group on products and pathways in the lifelong learning ecosystem. Who has put their hand up to report back?
That was the wonderful Sarah O'Shea.
Oh, wonderful. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, I didn't know we'd be going first because I'm still trying to gather my thoughts here. So it was a really very engaged conversation. So thank you to everyone. I hope I've captured what was said, but if anyone wants to interrupt or put something in the chat pod, please do. So obviously one of the key points that came up was the importance of career support and careers practitioners, and how they're key to things such as micro-credentialing. Just to ensure that the choices that are made by students when they choose micro-credentialing are informed, and also that these careers support people and practitioners have a equity lens when sort of in their roles. And so one of the, sorry, I'm trying to go down here because there was quite a lot around career support and careers practitioners. One of the key things is that that we need to know that micro-credentials are breadcrumbs to learning, as Sally quoted Beverly Oliver, but importantly, enabling programs shouldn't be placed under the micro-credentialing sort of platform, because enabling programs do something quite different, we felt collectively as a group, and that micro-credentials need to be framed very carefully, that show the linkages between a micro-credential and further qualifications. And that led us on to a discussion that Trina introduced, which was the concept of equity first micro-credentialing, and to recognize that this can be an important first step in learning, and that not only is it a pathway in, or a micro-credential was a pathway into university, but also a potential pathway out. at the end of a degree, or even if students don't complete a degree, a micro-credential can be a really key component to ensure that the skills that they have learned on their degree are actually transferable into the workplace. And that also then led into another thread in our conversation, which is around the importance of, for lifelong learning, that there are really key partnerships with industry to ensure that qualifications that are being offered across the sector mirror what employers want or need. But that these needs need to be articulated very, very carefully. So I'm not sure who it was, and I apologize, mentioned that too often, you know, a job ad will say a degree in social science is needed, but that's very vague. So it's sort of a responsibility for both parties, for institutions to clearly articulate what a degree, the kinds of skills that a learner acquires in a degree, but equally for industry to clearly articulate what is it that they want from graduates. And I know this is a sort of an old argument, but micro-credentials actually offer the opportunity to do that translation work, is what I picked up from the conversations. Megan from UOW talked about how open learning platforms can offer great potential in the outreach space, and used an example from Wollongong that it actually, now that they're trialing an open learning platform in the concept of lifelong learning, but they're using that in an outreach and equity space with a lot of success, because it enables students to have a taster without all the additional admin that most people would be aware of, where often students have to be enrolled, they have to become a university student, but an open learning platform sort of does away with that, allows students to have a taster and to dip in and out a little bit. And I think beyond that, it was really the importance of micro-credentialing. Going back to micro-credentialing, we went back quite a few times to sort of short open courses, in recognizing how they can really open up educational aspirations. So they can really instill confidence in people who maybe have had quite negative early education experiences, have left school early. And a micro-credential is that lovely sort of taster for a lot of people, and also, but that needs to be made explicit. So when someone reaches the end of a micro-credential, or during a micro-credential, the links between what they're learning and the knowledge that they're acquiring, and how that might translate into a higher education degree, or indeed a vocational qualification, really needs to be made explicit. And I think I've sort of tried to encapsulate it all, but I'll stop and hand over maybe to Sally in case I've missed something.
Thank you so much.
No, it was fantastic. Thank you. I think you captured it all. I'm just going to put in the chat, I think our concluding comment, and again, I apologise I didn't see who it was from, was Viva la Revolution. So, so it's Trina's point about, making this work for us. And being articulate about that. So thank you, Sarah, that was fantastic.
Yeah, and also, like just as a reflection, on how open are we as employers, right? Universities as employers to micro-credentials, and how would we assess, like somebody who comes with micro-credential as an applicant for jobs that we offer, which I hadn't considered before. So that's, it's very thought-provoking. Thank you to Sally's and Sarah's group. Kylie's group on approaches to widening participation, and I see the gorgeous baby has joined us.
So handing over to Jim. He was Jim Misko from Western Sydney. He's going to provide an update from our group.
Thanks, Kylie. I'm going to summarise this as best I can, but if anyone, as was mentioned earlier, if anyone has anything to add, please jump in at any time if I've left anything out. But we talked initially about some of the issues around increasing the knowledge of other pathways apart from higher education pathways, and whether there needed to be a focus on partnerships with other vocational providers to ensure that we look at raising that awareness level as has been done with higher education options through university pathways, and whether we need to expand that level of partnership that is in place with other vocational providers to ensure that those vocational pathways are also the awareness levels for that are increased as well. There was talks about, is it in the best interest for school education departments to target specific demographics to ensure that each school has exposure to opportunities rather than leaving each school to kind of fend for themselves in that space. There's a bit of a dichotomy in working with schools, in that you often ask questions about why aren't there opportunities being provided to certain schools, but then teachers at some of the schools often asking why you're starting so young with some of the younger cohorts that we have worked with in some of these programs that are out there. The intersection between equity and widening participation departments and marketing departments within institutions is often still ill-defined, and I think that's an ongoing thing that that I've seen across this sector for a long time, and unfortunately that still exists today. There were comments around in everything that we do in widening participation and growing widening participation across the sector, do we allow students enough time to understand and recognise their strengths? So before we sort of funnel or channel them towards making decisions, so are we providing them with enough background and core information for them to understand what they're good at and recognise their strengths and help them map towards a specific course pathway or career pathway that's suitable to them. So ultimately, again, bringing back into student choice as being the key that we should all be focusing on. There was a comment around no standardisation for careers advice, and that some teachers may often gatekeep certain information for certain cohorts of students, and I think we've all seen that at some stages. And one of the real interesting outtake, I guess, is that, again, going back to giving these students knowledge to make well-informed decisions, is that the development of a formal higher education knowledge curriculum would be beneficial across the sector. And this is something that needed to be a consistent scaffolded approach, which ultimately, if developed and implemented well, may eliminate some of the competitive approaches that do still unfortunately exist between institutions. So I think that's our discussion in a nutshell. I'm not sure, Kylie, was there anything else that I missed out on there?
No, I think you captured it beautifully. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, that was terrific. And every time this comes up, this intersection between widening participation and marketing, I feel like, we should really sort of do a how-to guide, how to talk to your marketing colleagues to define the intersection. I feel we've been talking about this for 12 years. And some of us have, managed to find receptive people in their institutions, and others haven't. I think, Kylie, we might have to look at that as a piece of PD, right?
Well, I think we need to throw it back to the department and the equity higher ed panel. Is how do we make these really clear distinctions in a policy environment as well, so it's very clear to institutions, what the differences are.
Yeah, super. Thank you so much, Jim and Kylie's group. Our group explored, should we subsidize general service provision? Yes, no, and then came to the conclusion that we might be asking the wrong questions. Nicole, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just share and on what Nadine just mentioned then, and then share a few questions and comments from our conversation. So yeah, Nadine really started us off by asking the question, do we maintain that these funds must not be used for general service provisions? And it sort of became clear that in many ways we're asking the wrong question. We're also focusing on 3 equity groups is outdated, and we can look at to best chance for all for that. And the reason being that when we're focusing on specific equity groups, it can lead to us excluding and othering when it comes to support provision, saying, oh no, you don't fit, tick that box, therefore we can't offer you support because we're not getting funded for that. So yeah, the suggestion was really to let's shift the question from the funding. Let's ask ourselves a different question, and also think about a different model of what we're doing in our universities in regard to support provision, and let's focus on one that's about student need. So there was, colleagues from a couple of different universities really focused on this shift to more of a universal design approach and needs-based service response, rather than offering a particular program to a particular subgroups of students. So it would be more inclusive to take a needs-based approach. And the point was made fairly strongly that, you know, anyone in a cohort can be in need, have different needs at different times, and it's actually really difficult to pinpoint the unique needs of a specific cohort. You know, students' needs are multiple and complex and change, fluctuate, and they're unlikely to be exclusive. So that was a major part of our conversation, but we also had conversations around the actual evaluation. So a question was, what is it in the way of evaluation that the department will accept or require of universities in their HEP reporting? Another comment about evaluation was needing robust ways of evaluating, and just really acknowledging it's hard enough when you're looking at evaluating one equity group. Now we need to think about, universities need to think about 3, but also untangling the 3. Might be quite tricky to unpack. So there was another comment about the need for standardisation of advice on how unis should be reporting. And towards the end, a colleague commented that we don't want the HEP funding to be used to support general services if at the same time that money's not going to outreach and widening participation. And I'll just finish with one comment that was made at the very beginning, and that was about the expansion of outreach to in the rural context. So the person was just wondering how this is, how people are going about this. Is it being tailor-made for the new cohort, or is outreach being based on approaches used in metro areas? So that's, a question for you to perhaps respond to. So I'll hand back to you, Nadine, and please do add anything I've missed.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Nicole, for the really detailed summary. Carolyn, did you want to talk, because you sort of got us onto the whole, I think we're asking the wrong question. Did you want to speak to that?
Oh, I just made the point that, we often talk about how do we segment out populations, and I made the point that we just need to rethink fundamentally our service models, because if we keep thinking about the widening participation supports as these bolt-on, we're always biasing towards particular student groups. And I think, like Sally, I'm just going to go back to your work and Karen's work, that one of the things that you recognized really early on, and this was, 15 years ago, the importance of the academic being a partner in the conversation. And we need to rethink now our service models and our strategies so that they're not bolt-on, but they're built into the course design of the student journey. So the students shouldn't have to go and access the supports. It should just be there when they need it, and it should be simple. And that means fundamentally rethinking our service models. It means rethinking how we work. And it means thinking about these things, not from a deficit model, but from a strength-based proactive model. And I think the other bit, and Rhonda and I were talking about this morning, is it's also about how do you bring the student into the conversation? So how do you also not assume need, but that the student is part of the solution? And that's one of the things that we've been trying to tackle, and that Rhonda in particular is working with us on at QET.
Super, thank you so much. Look, colleagues, we have covered tremendous ground in like a really, really condensed conversation. I can't believe, we are not sort of running and rushing to the finish line. And actually, I have an opportunity to invite you for any further reflection, any other comments on, potentially if you were in a group that you weren't super keen to be in and want to contribute to another topic. This is really your opportunity now, because we have a bit of time up our sleeves. So I'm opening it back up to the floor. Go.
One of the things I've been really surprised at is this whole reliance that we have on in higher ed in Australia on soft funding. I think that we actually need to challenge that. And one of the things is I would love to see that the soft funding, that universities use soft funding, but then they have a mandate that they have to then build it into core service and transition off the soft funding. Because one thing I'm hearing over and over again is when suddenly we have the SAF funding regulations or the HEP funding regulations shift, then suddenly all of our programs aren't sustainable anymore. And one of the things, for example, that I was thinking about when I first came to Australia is we had a lot of our peer programs at QUT HEP funded. And that was really fantastic work led by Jen Trednick and Victoria Menzies. But one of the things we've done is we've kept that strategy now, but we've transitioned it into core university-based funding, and that means it's sustainable. And I think that's the bit for me that's missing in the conversation. These shouldn't be short-term initiatives. If we're serious about changing the culture, having a short burst of funding is not enough. There needs to be some sort of accountability for universities to take this on in a sustainable, ongoing way. And I would love to see that linked into, you can have the soft funding for 3 years, but then by the end of the 3 years, you need to have figured out how to do this on an ongoing basis. Because otherwise, it's just, quite frankly, will continue to be surface level. And I think where we've made the biggest inroads is when it's deep and it's part of the university cultures. So just rallying the horses or whatever you call it, but that would be my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, that's right. And it is similar, Carolyn, to the, WPV marketing conversation, right? Like this was something that we talked about from the start. And the trouble that I have always been in, so I have consistently worked in universities, had about $5 million worth of HEP funding a year. And that is, like when you think about it, it's a lot of money to hand out, so you have to really think about how you spend, $5 million well. But at the same time, they have never been, the universities have never been in a position to fully replace $5 million, in 3 years' time. So that has always been sort of the challenge, the dynamic. Yeah. Other comments? Sue? No.
I'd just like to say that I agree that the academic has a big role to play in this, and partnerships with the professional staff and academics together working around the student experience, as Sally talks about, that it really is critical if we can actually get that partnership going a little bit much stronger. Because I think the funding, because it's at UTS, I know we had funding changes because of the HEP, and suddenly this group lost money. Well, why wasn't it already? We should be part of the program. It should be that building, but we keep changing staff, we keep changing perspectives, and it's how do we get that embedded from the top down, I think, and getting that concept. We don't, it's got to be a top-down conversation.
I think one of the things, though, that dissuades universities from doing that is actually how we evaluate impact. Because I keep, and this is one of the things I find really hard, is if you want to have impact and improve your retention and attrition, you want to be targeted, focused, and focus on particular cohorts. And then you want to take your resources and be really targeted. If you want to do well on the SES, it's all about access and visibility to service. And so inherently, if you want to do well in the SES, you might do really well in one national survey, and then you tank in the other. And now all of our funding is linked to these competitive environments. So that's like at QUT, I stopped one-on-one supports being first come, first serve, and then had to take a hit on my SES scores. But lo and behold, in key areas, it helped our retention and attrition. So I think that's the other side of the coin is what are we incentivized to do based on how the sector evaluates what is success?
Yep, absolutely. We're getting a few comments in the chat. Anyone of the people who did want to talk to that? Anybody wants to respond to the comments that are emerging in the chat? So we're talking about, bringing students in. So do we have any examples of really great co-design processes and approaches? Have people reached out to their equity cohorts in redesigning they have programs? Do you think we have a better sense now of what the different student cohorts need and want? People been in that space?
You go, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that because I always like to plug the centre, we have just finalised a couple of careers grants for students from those socioeconomic backgrounds, rural, remote and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And one of those was led by Molly Dollinger. And Molly did the whole research project was around co-design and careers advice. So that report is still pending, but watch this space. It should be released very soon. And I will just do a plug for Kylie, who also led another one of those projects, as well as Sue Kilpatrick over in UTAS, and Dawn Bennett and Jane Colley here in Curtin. So they're on the way, and I think they would also inform some of these conversations.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Sarah. Rhonda.
Nadine, just to reiterate what we talked about in our group, we've taken to asking students as they come on board through an instrument we've developed what their needs are. We then filter that by the equity groups and we respond personally to each of those students. So every student is afforded the opportunity to amplify their own voice. And then we prioritise the more intensive work to the equity students or our own special little equity group, those students who have who express complex circumstances and are deemed to be most at risk. So trying to address the needs as we identify them while fulfilling the obligation to focus on particular groups of students. We're having good success with that. It's also having a knock-on effect for participation by identified equity groups in our catalogue of support, because they feel like it is being targeted to their stated needs.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, looks so great. And I think, you know, this is part of what this group is about. You know, this is about sharing good practice. This is about, you know, cross-referencing people's works. So please keep it coming, you know, like in the chat as we're wrapping this up. A really quick word on next steps. So Sally, Kylie and I are going to get together, you know, with our detailed notes, and please can I ask Sarah, Jim and Nicole to forward your notes in whatever form. I'm happy for you to, you know, if you've typed them up, fantastic, but if you've handwritten, I'm happy for you to take a photo and send them through. But just so that we collect the notes from this discussion, and we're going to, you know, work them into a few bullet points that we might want to share with the department, and we'll feed this back to this group for any additional comment. If you feel you have any additional resources that are particularly pertinent to this conversation, please forward them to one of us individually, and we'll put them in the mix. Thank you so much to everyone for your participation. Thank you to Sally and Kylie for co-hosting and really, you know, like making my job so much easier and so much more enjoyable, which has been super. Thank you to all of you for your really engaged contributions. It feels like such a long time that we haven't come together in you know, as a group like that. I know we're all hanging for that to be, you know, in person again, but you know, at least from my perspective, I think it's worked a treat. Thanks, Kylie, for sharing your tech skills with us, who made this work super well. And I'm sure Tracy, you know, is sighing a sigh of relief that this all went off without a hitch. So thanks a lot for joining us today. I hope you get the opportunity to join other STARS networking sessions who are running during the week, and I might see one or two of you in the actual conference program proper. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.